What does it look like when the quiet tension between a player and coach finally explodes, on live television no less? It looks like millions of fans watching a quarterback lean back in his chair, stare directly into the camera, and drop a statement so sharp, so undeniable, that every ounce of carefully crafted organizational polish shatters instantly. And it looks like a head coach pretending to smile, while the internet instantly turns him into a meme. That's exactly what unfolded during ESPN's primetime special, featuring quarterback Shedeur Sanders and Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski. One single answer to a seemingly harmless question created ripple effects that no one in Cleveland's front office could possibly control. In that instant, the quarterback and the coach stopped looking like teammates working toward the same goal. They became opponents in a very public battle for credibility and authority. Televised sports are supposed to follow a script, carefully worded responses, jokes about teamwork, sound bites that convince fans everything behind the scenes is perfectly fine. But Sanders refused to play his part. Instead, he played the room. He turned what should have been a promotional fluff piece into something resembling courtroom drama, where honesty acted as the gavel. With one sentence, delivered flatly, without blinking, he forced fans, teammates, and executives to take sides. The moment was electric because it wasn't sanitized. It wasn't filtered through publicists or rehearsed media training. Sanders stared into the lens as if he knew the entire football world was listening. And with absolute clarity, he leveled an accusation that everyone in the building understood immediately. The real problem isn't me, it's him. From there, the whole tone of the night flipped. ESPN had intended a cozy segment, but what they got instead was unplanned, uncontainable drama. And here's the crucial part. Audiences didn't just watch, they reacted. Within minutes, Twitter timelines filled with reaction clips. TikToks dissecting Stefanski's body language racked up hundreds of thousands of views before the commercial break even ended. Fans online weren't analyzing plays or statistics. They were analyzing smirks, arm crossing, and headset adjustments. To put it bluntly, Sanders had cooked his coach on national television, and people couldn't stop talking about it. But what happened in that studio wasn't an accident. That's what makes this story different from your garden variety sports spat. According to multiple insiders, Sanders didn't just slip up or speak rashly, he timed his words. He understood the power of his position, the ammunition of his stats, and the audience that would amplify any crack in the coaching armor. This wasn't just a rogue comment. It was controlled demolition, performed in prime time. And that's why this moment matters far more than a passing viral clip. It wasn't just a rookie quarterback answering a tough question. It was one of the most visible young players in the league, signaling openly, in front of millions, that he was no longer willing to stay quiet, no longer willing to play the traditional role of seen but not heard. For Cleveland, it was less about one interview going off the rails and more about the birth of an entirely new player-power dynamic. So now, we're left with some massive questions. What exactly drove this long-simmering conflict to the boiling point? Why was that interview the stage Sanders chose to launch his message? And most importantly, how did one rookie turn a single sentence into the kind of bombshell statement that shakes a franchise to its core? Because this isn't merely about football anymore. It's about leadership, pride, authority, and the generational shift that's rippling through sports at every level. And if you thought that TV moment was the peak of the story, think again. That was only the opening shot in a much bigger battle. What happens when months of quiet tension between a star player and his head coach erupt? Not in the locker room, not during practice, but on live, primetime television. The answer: millions of fans stunned, one coach visibly rattled, and an entire franchise suddenly thrown into chaos. That, in short, is what quarterback Shedeur Sanders unleashed when he decided to stop speaking in polite sound bites and instead deliver a surgical strike straight through the camera lens. The setup seemed harmless. ESPN rolled out a feel-good segment designed to highlight teamwork and harmony inside the Cleveland Browns. The format was familiar. A few questions tossed around, a couple of lighthearted jokes, maybe even a cliché about just taking it one game at a time. But Sanders refused to play along. When he was asked about his role within the offensive system, he didn't dodge or deflect. He dropped a line so sharp, so undeniably transparent, that the audience instantly understood. He wasn't just answering a question, he was taking aim. The contrast was almost theatrical. Sanders spoke calmly, eyes fixed on the camera, commanding the moment with absolute composure. Meanwhile, every twitch of head coach Kevin Stefanski's body seemed to betray discomfort. Shifting in his chair, forcing a smile, blinking rapidly while trying to look unbothered. It was the kind of split-screen television gold producers dream about. A confident young quarterback calmly asserting himself, and a head coach looking like he'd just been thrown into interrogation, and social media absolutely erupted. Twitter feeds filled with disbelief. TikTok edits replayed the moment with dramatic sound effects, and Instagram stories flooded with commentary before the show even cut to commercial. One clip alone pulled in millions of views overnight, with captions pointing out exactly what fans were thinking. Sanders cooked Stefanski on live TV. But make no mistake, this was not a careless outburst from an emotional rookie. Insiders say this was a calculated move, the product of frustration building for weeks behind the scenes. Sanders chose his words carefully, delivered them at maximum volume on the loudest stage possible, and with one calm statement, he flipped the balance of power inside the Browns organization. In that single moment, he stopped being a rookie trying to earn respect and became a challenger daring authority to prove its worth. And that's what makes this story so electrifying. It's bigger than stats, bigger than one awkward TV segment. It's a collision between old-school coaching control and a new generation of athletes determined to shape their own destinies. Sanders didn't just reveal tension. He exposed a larger fight about leadership, accountability, and what it takes to command a team in today's NFL. So here's the question we're left with. Was this the bold declaration of a future superstar? Or the spark that could consume an entire franchise? The clock hadn't even ticked past 8 minutes into ESPN's primetime special before the broadcast spiraled wildly off script. What was supposed to be a polished, media-friendly conversation about team chemistry instantly veered into uncharted territory the moment Shedeur Sanders leaned forward, locked eyes with the camera, and answered a routine question with devastating honesty. The host's question seemed innocent enough. How did Sanders view his role in Cleveland's offensive system? 99 out of 100 players would have given the stock reply, something about respecting the process, supporting teammates, and staying patient. Sanders, however, wasn't interested in stock replies. Instead, he delivered a line that instantly silenced the room. "I can't control who benches me. I just control what I do on the field. And everybody knows what happens when I actually get to play." No raised voice, no dramatic flair, just steady eye contact, sharp words, and an expression that said he meant every syllable. It landed like a thunderclap. The studio audience gasped, then broke into laughter and applause. Viewers at home clipped the moment within seconds, blasting it across social platforms with captions that spread faster than any marketing campaign ESPN could have dreamed of. If Sanders sounded unbothered, then Kevin Stefanski looked the exact opposite. The cameras didn't miss a beat. A strained grin stretched across his face, his eyes flickering nervously, his shoulders shifting as though he were trying to physically escape the spotlight. Even before social media analysts weighed in, anyone watching could sense the power dynamic had just flipped. On one side, a quarterback radiating confidence. On the other, a coach struggling to conceal discomfort in real time. And then the internet did what it always does, turn the moment into a digital bonfire. Within minutes, hashtags linked to Sanders trended nationally. TikTok compilations layered the clip with dramatic music, calling it the exact second the Browns' locker room shifted. Twitter lit up with fans declaring Sanders the future, while countless freeze frames of Stefanski's awkward expression circulated under captions like, "This is the look of a man who knows he just got cooked." But viewers also realized this wasn't random. The careful wording, the slow delivery, this didn't feel like an impulsive slip. It felt calculated. By speaking calmly instead of angrily, Sanders emphasized control while still landing a gut-level punch. It was the verbal equivalent of throwing a perfect pass. Precise, efficient, and devastating in its impact. That's why this moment became so much more than another viral clip. It wasn't just funny, it wasn't just dramatic, it was a public power move. In a single statement, Sanders rewrote the perception of Cleveland's internal dynamics. Fans weren't just laughing, they were choosing sides. And once the sides are chosen, the game changes forever. To understand why Shedeur Sanders chose that moment on that stage to fire his shot, you have to rewind the clock a few months. That mic drop line wasn't born in a vacuum. It was built out of weeks, maybe even months, of friction bubbling beneath the surface inside the Browns organization. It started quietly, long before television cameras were anywhere near the picture. During training camp, whispers circulated about disagreements between Sanders and the coaching staff. Reports suggest he questioned play-calling decisions behind closed doors, particularly the conservative approach that seemed designed to shrink rather than showcase his explosive ability. Sanders wasn't reckless about it. He voiced his concerns privately, in film rooms and strategy sessions. But each time, insiders say, his opinions were brushed off by Stefanski in favor of system execution and playing within the structure. That phrase, playing within the structure, might sound harmless, but for a quarterback who thrives on big plays and improvisation, it felt like a leash. Sanders wasn't just being asked to play football. He was being asked to suppress the very instincts that made him special. And when pushback was ignored again and again, the tension kept climbing. Sources inside the facility describe those weeks as increasingly strained. Sanders would finish extra film study, arrive early for workouts, and consistently prepare at a level that impressed veteran teammates. Yet despite outperforming others statistically in limited opportunities, his playing time stayed tight. Coaches argued about him in meetings, some pushing hard for a bigger role, others sticking to the "he has to wait his turn" philosophy. The divide spread beyond X's and O's. It was turning into a referendum on what the Browns wanted their offense, and perhaps their identity, to become. This wasn't just strategy. It was generational philosophy colliding in real time. On one side, you had Stefanski's old-school stance. Authority comes from the headset. Players fall in line. On the other, Sanders embodied the modern athlete, data-proven performance, confidence in front of cameras, and an understanding that fans rally behind authenticity over cliches. In that clash of outlooks, one thing was becoming obvious. Only one voice could truly lead the team forward. By the time ESPN's cameras rolled in, the battle lines had already been drawn. Sanders wasn't walking into a cozy interview. He was walking into an arena, and he knew it. That's why his words rang so sharply. They weren't improvisation, they were culmination. They carried the weight of weeks in film rooms, locker room whispers, and ignored frustrations. And when he finally spoke them on national television, he wasn't just answering a question. He was bringing the behind-the-scenes conflict screaming into the spotlight. The viral explosion may have looked sudden, but the slow burn that led there had been smoldering all season. On the surface, Shedeur Sanders' words during that ESPN interview could be viewed as simple frustration bleeding into the spotlight. After all, athletes speak out all the time. What's different about this? The difference lies in how controlled it all felt. Sanders didn't stutter. He didn't ramble. He wasn't fidgeting or visibly emotional. Instead, His tone was measured, his body language steady, and his timing surgically precise. That calm delivery is exactly what made the statement sting even more. This is where analysts began to split. Was Sanders just venting an honest truth bubbling inside him? Or had he deliberately set this moment up as a calculated strike? From the perspective of communication strategy, the evidence leans heavily toward the latter. Let's break down the language. His opener, "I can't control who benches me," wasn't just a complaint. It was a direct acknowledgement of Stefanski's authority, positioned in a way that also highlighted the coach's controversial decision-making without ever mentioning him by name. Immediately after, Sanders shifted gears. "I just control what I do on the field." That's a textbook professionalism clause, sending the signal that he wasn't being reckless, just speaking facts. Then came the hammer. "Everybody knows what happens when I actually get to play." In 6 words, he flipped the burden of proof entirely onto his coaches. It wasn't anger. It was logic wrapped in confidence. Every phrase carried a double edge, respectful enough not to cross into open insubordination, but bold enough to spark doubt about Stefanski's judgment. This is why body language experts jumped on the clip with such enthusiasm. Sanders' unwavering gaze into the camera suggested dominance, not defiance. It said, "I don't need to raise my voice." The truth is already obvious. Contrast that with Stefanski. Nervous adjustments, rapid blinking, and a stiff smile screamed discomfort. The optics were terrible. The rookie quarterback appeared to be in control, while the veteran coach looked like he had just been cornered. Whether or not Sanders actually planned it in advance almost didn't matter, because the audience interpreted it as masterful chess. And here's the kicker. Networks ate it up. ESPN producers reportedly extended coverage on the fly, milking the confrontation for every ounce of viral oxygen. Analysts on rival sports shows replayed the clip like courtroom evidence, dissecting tone, phrasing, and intent. Former quarterbacks describe Sanders' style as respectfully confrontational, a rare balance that allows you to deliver a knockout blow without looking unprofessional. So was it raw honesty or calculated warfare? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Sanders probably meant every word. But the delivery, the pacing, the precision, the confidence suggests this wasn't just truth spilling out. It was truth sharpened into a weapon. And by firing it off on national television, Sanders proved he wasn't simply participating in the conversation. He was controlling it. What really decides the outcome of a public clash like this isn't just what's said on television. It's how the locker room reacts once the cameras turn off. Coaches can survive awkward interviews, and players can move on from spicy comments. But when teammates begin whispering, when sides begin quietly forming, that's when something small transforms into a structural crisis. And in Cleveland, that's exactly what sources suggest happened. Behind closed doors, veterans reportedly admitted they respected Sanders for saying what a lot of players were already thinking. Offensive linemen, who normally guard their words carefully, have been described as frustrated with Stefanski's play calling, which often limited the quarterback's ability to push the ball downfield. Wide receivers, too, were quietly nodding in agreement, pointing to the obvious chemistry they felt when Sanders was under center compared to others. Even some defensive veterans, far removed from play-calling debates, allegedly acknowledged that organizational dysfunction was dragging down the entire team. But here's where it gets complicated. Not everyone was thrilled about Sanders taking the fight public. Older players, in particular, worried about the ripple effects of challenging a head coach so openly. For them, it wasn't about whether Sanders was right or wrong. It was about what such defiance does to the hierarchy. In professional football, authority, however flawed, has long been the glue keeping 30-plus personalities moving in one direction. Break that glue, and you risk chaos. Younger players, though, they loved it. They saw Sanders as someone brave enough to say the things most rookies wouldn't dare whisper. To them, it wasn't reckless, it was refreshing. Instead of mouthing platitudes, he spoke with conviction. They admired how his words matched his work ethic, how he backed up boldness with preparation. One anonymous teammate even commented to local reporters, "He just said what we all talk about anyway." The difference is, he said it where the coach had to hear it too. That generational split, quiet caution from the old guard, enthusiastic applause from the rising core, created tension nobody could neatly resolve. Position coaches, caught in the middle, found themselves pulled in two directions, empathizing with Sanders' frustrations on one hand, but still needing to show loyalty to the head coach on the other. The result? A facility atmosphere where every comment, every half-smile in a meeting became loaded with meaning. Publicly, players kept their faces straight, but insiders insist the private conversations told the real story. The team respected Sanders' authenticity more than Stefanski's forced diplomacy. In other words, authority inside the locker room was no longer tied to the headset. It was leaning toward the guy in the huddle. And once a locker room starts tipping in that direction, it's nearly impossible to tilt it back. If you thought the drama ended the moment ESPN cut to commercial, think again. That's when the story really exploded. Because once social media got hold of it, there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. Within minutes, Twitter, or X, depending on who you ask, was overflowing with clips of Shedeur Sanders calmly calling out his coach without ever raising his voice. Captions ranged from gleeful, "This kid just cooked Stefanski on live television," to reverent, "Future franchise QB energy right here." By the following morning, the soundbite was clipped, remixed, and subtitled in every imaginable form. TikTok creators added dramatic music and fiery captions, while Instagram Reels spread freeze frames of Stefanski's forced smile like wildfire. And here's the thing, it wasn't just fans joking around. National talk shows latched onto the segment immediately. Colin Cowherd devoted an entire breakdown to the body language contrast. Shannon Sharpe declared Sanders had graduated from rookie to leader in one sentence. Even Skip Bayless, who never misses a chance to stir the pot, framed it as a generational clash in the NFL, calling it the exact kind of moment where dominance shifts hands. The media didn't just cover the drama, they magnified it. Every network replayed the clip, dissecting tone, pause, cadence, and intent as if it were a courtroom deposition. And because controversy is rocket fuel for engagement, producers leaned in. This wasn't a story about game film anymore. It was a cultural conversation about leadership, authority, and authenticity. Fans, meanwhile, split almost predictably along age lines. Older supporters bristled at what they saw as direct disrespect toward a head coach. For them, hierarchy had always mattered. Coaches lead, players follow. Full stop. To them, Sanders' words, no matter how true, eroded the discipline and unity required for success. Younger fans saw something very different. To them, Sanders wasn't being disrespectful. He was telling the truth that others were too scared to say aloud. Online forums blew up with comments praising his boldness. Reddit threads crowned him as the player who finally refused to accept mediocrity in Cleveland. One top-voted post read simply, "He just said out loud what we've all been screaming at our TVs for 2 years." Even local media personalities felt pulled into the storm. Radio shows in Cleveland canceled guests just to let callers vent. Newspapers splashed the confrontation across their sports sections as though it were a playoff headline. The media ecosystem didn't just report the story, it accelerated it, ensuring the Sanders versus Stefanski narrative overshadowed everything else about the team. And so, in less than 24 hours, one calm sentence had morphed into the city's biggest headline, a national talking point, and the NFL's juiciest viral debate. Fans weren't just reacting anymore. They were choosing sides. By the time Cleveland's front office arrived at work the morning after the interview, the damage was already done. The clip was everywhere, on sports highlight reels, front pages of local news, even spilling into mainstream morning shows usually reserved for politics and weather chatter. In one night, the Browns weren't being discussed for touchdowns or standings. They were being dissected for dysfunction. And nobody in leadership had a playbook for this. Reports quickly surfaced that owner Jimmy Haslam called an emergency meeting before lunchtime. The topics weren't just about containing the PR storm. They were far heavier. Could Kevin Stefanski still run the locker room with credibility? Should Sanders' role on the field be immediately expanded to capitalize on his popularity? And most awkward of all, how long could the organization afford to drag out a culture clash that had gone viral worldwide? At the same time, Sanders' agent was allegedly on the phone with team representatives, seizing the chance to turn momentum into leverage. The message was clear. His client had proven both his talent and his star power. And it was time the organization treated him accordingly. These weren't haphazard grumblings about playing time anymore. Now, contractual influence and long-term positioning were in the conversation. Topics that make executives break into cold sweats. Meanwhile, General Manager Andrew Berry found himself walking a tightrope. On one side, he had to show loyalty to Stefanski, a coach the organization had extended and invested in. On the other, he couldn't ignore the fans chanting Sanders' name, the players quietly respecting his authenticity, or the undeniable numbers showing his efficiency on the field. To defend the coach too strongly risked alienating the star. To side with Sanders too openly risked undermining the head of the staff. Either way, Cleveland looked fractured. If that wasn't enough, the NFL's coaching carousel began spinning before the Browns had even finished addressing the crisis. Media insiders reported that agents representing potential replacements reached out quietly, planting seeds just in case Cleveland made a change. The mere perception that Stefanski's job was at risk only fueled the fire. Suddenly, it wasn't just fans debating Sanders versus Stefanski. It was an entire industry circling, wondering who the Browns' next coach might be. The irony? ESPN executives, the ones who thought the segment would be a harmless puff piece, were thrilled. Ratings were through the roof, engagement metrics were staggering, and Sanders had become one of the most talked about players in the league overnight. What was misery for the Browns' front office was television gold for the network. Inside Cleveland headquarters, though, it was anything but gold. It was survival mode. The Browns had stumbled into a public chess match, with their quarterback seizing control of the board in one chilling move. And for Stefanski, the walls were closing in faster than anyone dared admit aloud. For all the viral memes, dramatic headlines, and dissected body language, football still comes down to production. A player can dominate press conferences, but if the on-field numbers don't match the hype, the story fizzles out. In Shedeur Sanders' case, the stats didn't just support his message, they amplified it. In limited opportunities, Sanders was making the most of every snap. His completion percentage edged past the established starters. His yards per attempt average was higher, meaning when he threw, the ball actually moved downfield. A stat sheet also carried a glaring 0 where turnovers usually live. No interceptions, no careless mistakes. Just clean, efficient football paired with touchdown drives that were far more consistent than anything his competition under center could generate. Even more eye-popping was Sanders' knack for the explosive play. In today's NFL, where highlight clicks fuel social media and quick strikes demoralize defenses, Sanders had a near uncanny ability to create moments that couldn't be ignored. A 40-yard dart on the run here, a clutch red zone strike there. The tape didn't lie. Every time he was inserted into the lineup, the offense suddenly looked faster, sharper, and frankly, more dangerous. Receivers noticed it immediately. Quietly, they confided to reporters that his ball placement made their jobs easier. The timing, the velocity, even the confidence with which he fired. Everything elevated their potential. Offensive linemen, often the least flashy but most brutally honest judges of quarterback play, admitted his ability to diagnose coverages pre-snap and adjust protections gave them more trust in the pocket. These weren't just sentimental teammates supporting the rookie underdog. These were seasoned professionals pointing to details only insiders see. And then came the advanced third down conversion percentages improved. Red zone scoring rates noticeably better. Every measurable category tilted in his favor, and by a significant margin. For fans already leaning towards Sanders as the future, these numbers became ammunition in online debates, drowning out critics who accused him of being too brash for speaking up. The more data surfaced, the more Stefanski's insistence on conservative rotations looked like stubbornness instead of strategy. Analysts on ESPN, Fox, and local radio stations began holding up charts, comparing Sanders' efficiency with the team's starter. The discrepancy was so undeniable that even commentators who typically side with coaches began openly asking the obvious. Why isn't this kid playing more? That's the danger when numbers back up attitude. A bold statement without proof can be brushed off as arrogance. But when boldness is fueled by undeniable performance, it becomes credibility. And in Cleveland, credibility was now tilting hard toward Sanders, transforming him not just into a viral sensation, but into the statistical heavyweight Stefanski could no longer ignore. When a player sparks controversy, wins the media cycle, and then backs it all up with on-field numbers, the consequences stretch far beyond the football facility. Suddenly, the debate isn't just who should be quarterback, it becomes a full-blown cultural wave that touches every part of the franchise, economically, socially, and competitively. Shedeur Sanders created exactly that kind of tidal force, and Cleveland felt the impact almost immediately. The first domino to topple was merchandise. Overnight, the team store couldn't keep Sanders jerseys on the shelves. Retailers in downtown Cleveland reported crowds making impulse buys simply to wear the kid's name around town. Online orders surged so dramatically that back orders stacked weeks deep. What had started as a viral clip quickly turned into real dollars, something every front office pays attention to. Then came the stadium buzz. Season ticket lines, which had cooled after years of disappointment, suddenly reignited. Call centers logged a spike in fans asking about availability, not because the Browns were winning Super Bowls, but because they wanted to be in the building to see Sanders play. If Stefanski ever gave him more snaps, even sports bars and restaurants got swept up in the surge. Owners noted record game day crowds, fueled less by the hope of victories and more by the hope of watching whatever drama Sanders would spark next. Local media couldn't ignore it either. Cleveland talk radio, already buzzing with divided opinions, began trending nationally as segments about Sanders versus Stefanski hit syndication. The Plain Dealer dedicated front-page space to the Sanders effect, analyzing his growing power within the city. Every outlet, from television news to blog sites, knew the formula. Put Sanders' name in the headline and engagement skyrocketed. Meanwhile, rival teams in the AFC North weren't laughing. They were analyzing. Word leaked that coordinators in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore were already reviewing Sanders' limited film, expecting his role to expand whether Stefanski liked it or not. By destabilizing his own team in public, Sanders had ironically made Cleveland's offense more difficult for opponents to prepare for, injecting uncertainty into divisional game plans. And what about the corporate side? Sponsorship opportunities. Sources say Sanders' social media followers exploded across platforms during that week, attracting partnership offers from brands desperate to align with authenticity and youth appeal. The Browns' marketing department knew instantly that regardless of Stefanski's discomfort, this quarterback was not just an athlete, He was a marketable asset, able to energize ticket sales, merchandise, and broadcasts in ways numbers alone couldn't explain. That's the true reach of the domino effect. One bold sentence on television had triggered a chain reaction. Jersey sales spiking, bars booming, rivals changing strategies, and brands lining up. Sanders. Words didn't just shake a coach. They shook the economics of Cleveland football. And once a player starts moving money, influence only grows. For Stefanski, that meant the walls closing in even tighter. For Sanders, it meant every snap, every quote, every highlight was building a new empire, one domino at a time. Every scandal, every power struggle reaches a moment where speculation gives way to action. For the Cleveland Browns, that moment came swiftly after Sanders' viral surge. Bull, it wasn't just tension in the air anymore, it was visible fractures across the organization. And at the very center stood a head coach who could no longer convincingly wear the mask of authority. Kevin Stefanski had walked a tightrope for weeks, trying to appear composed during practice sessions, team meetings, and press conferences. But insiders say his body language told the real story. Coaches whispered about his increasing defensiveness. Players noticed his closed-off posture, and staff described a man drained by stress. When veteran leaders on the Browns quietly requested private meetings with ownership, meetings specifically about coaching confidence, the writing was suddenly in bold, flashing neon letters. The front office had no choice but to confront the obvious. Sanders wasn't just a quarterback anymore. He had become the gravitational pull around which the rest of the team and fan base revolved. Every stat, every highlight, every replay of that TV moment made Stefanski look smaller, weaker, and more out of sync with the modern direction of the franchise. The power dynamic had flipped, and once flipped, there was no flipping back. Emergency boardroom talks turned into a countdown clock. Rumors leaked of potential replacements, interim coaches who could stabilize the locker room, bold names circling from the college ranks, coordinators eager to slide into the big chair. And with each leak, Stefanski's credibility shattered further. By the time news broke that he had submitted his resignation, citing philosophical differences, it felt less like a shock and more like the final step in a process everyone had already witnessed publicly. For Sanders, though, the aftermath was a coronation. He walked into practice the next morning carrying the same calm demeanor he'd shown on ESPN. Only now, teammates greeted him with an unmistakable energy shift. Offensive drills buzzed, receivers sprinted harder, linemen blocked longer. Reports from the facility said efficiency spiked, not because plays suddenly changed, but because the locker room finally knew whose voice carried weight. Fans read the moment the same way. Instead of grief over their coach's departure, Cleveland celebrated the symbolic rebirth of their team. Social feeds filled with comments dubbing Sanders the franchise cornerstone. Hashtags like #FutureTime trended as locals treated his quiet media strike as the spark that lit an overdue revolution. The breaking point, once dreaded by management, became the very thing that gave Cleveland hope. Stefanski was gone, Sanders stood tall, and in just 1 week, the Browns' identity flipped. In the end, what unfolded in Cleveland was never just about a rookie quarterback clashing with his head coach. It was about something larger, an unmistakable generational shift in how athletes claim their power. For decades, coaches wielded unquestioned authority, their word treated as law, no matter the circumstances. But Sanders quietly demonstrated that in today's era, authority isn't granted by a headset. It's earned through performance, authenticity, and the connection a player builds with teammates and fans. With one calm statement, Sanders exposed the tension between old-school control and new-school empowerment. By matching his bold words with undeniable numbers, He showed that honesty backed by production can shake even the most rigid hierarchies. What might have been dismissed as a rookie's frustration instead became a turning point. Proof that confidence and authenticity now carry as much weight as strategy boards and coaching titles. Cleveland found itself transformed, not by a dramatic playoff win, but by a sentence broadcast across millions of screens. And as the dust settles, one truth is clear. Shedeur Sanders didn't just win a moment, he rewrote the rules of leadership. The franchise has changed, and so has the league's understanding of power.